Hi everyone, this is the final part of the chapter called The Afterlife. We left off on page 48. Again, I will continue to model during reading strategies such as making predictions or making personal connections or visualizing, making mental pictures as I read. I'm also going to continue to model asking questions while reading, in particular thin and thick questions. In future chapters, you will be asked to write some of your own thin and thick questions. So anytime you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me. So page 48, almost in the middle. He explained the rules and they began a practice game. The object was to secure territory, arranging groups of stones into living communities that couldn't be extinguished by your opponent. Brent felt he was practicing constructing his new life. Out of nowhere, the word "cuirass" came to mind from the Vonnegut book he'd read in English, a term for a disparate group of people linked together without their knowledge. Your family and friends were not part of your cuirass. You couldn't choose its members and might never know who was in it or what its purpose was. Brent felt certain that Leah was a member of his. Was the cyclist part of it too? Sunset flared orange on the water. Firecrackers began going off. Now, just in those two sentences where sunset flared orange on the water and the firecrackers, I immediately can make a visualization of the 4th of July, either being on the water and seeing the sunset and those gorgeous colors, or hearing and seeing fireworks, especially on the promenade when I was younger. So again, I just demonstrated how two during reading strategies can be used to further your comprehension of the reading. "Ah, yes," said the man, "noise-making devices to dispel evil spirits on this important day." Brent couldn't reveal why he shared the same distanced perspective. This second time around, he saw everything from the outside. Much that he'd taken for granted before now struck him as curious. Handshaking, the Pledge of Allegiance, neckties on men, sports teams named for animals. The sky shifted to shades from the spectrum's outer edges, then went black. The cyclist lit a tiny gas lamp that hissed and glowed like a shard from a star. By its light, they played another hour, then retired. Brent climbed into his sleeping bag. Radios, firecrackers, voices subsided, replaced by the chirring of crickets, a breeze's passage through the trees, the waves' steady respiration. The non-human world was emerging, a world he'd rarely noticed, another hidden city. Now, for those of you who camp, I refuse to camp, so those of you who have camped out can really visualize all these noises and have the sensory details really pop up in your mind. Mine's a little bit more difficult. I can do it based on prior knowledge of being outside at dusk maybe, but I've never wanted to spend time in a tent or outside a tent camping. Was Leah now a citizen here? He wondered if the creature he heard creeping over dry leaves could be her. He imagined her fully fluent here, able to hear and comprehend what he couldn't, her sense of smell greatly magnified, this bit of shoreline known to her as it never would be to him. He looked up at the stars glinting silently, a movie without a soundtrack. Or was he simply deaf to their music? He realized he knew no constellation. Likewise, the names of trees, flowers, rocks, birds, insects, fish. He was a foreigner here. He wished he knew some names. When he awoke, the cyclist was just leaving. It was cold. Brent's bag was damp with dew. Huddling within, waiting for the sun to top the trees and warm the world, he understood why people had worshipped it. 2 hours later, he'd taken a shower, breakfasted on French bread and cheese, skimmed 3 chapters of the Whirligig book, and picked the simplest project offered, an angel whose spinning arms played a harp. He studied the diagrams apprehensively. Neither he nor his father was the popular mechanics type. There were practically no tools in his house. Those he'd brought with him had all been bought new. It had been 4 years since he'd taken woodshop, where he'd spent weeks on a simple hinged top box. Maybe he'd changed in that time. He felt Leah and Mrs. Zamora watching him and hoped that he had. He walked to his pack. He'd brought 4 pieces of plywood, 1 foot by 2 feet, marine grade, half an inch thick. He drew one out, sat at the table, and sketched the angel's outline on it, then erased it all. Freehand drawing was not his forte either. It took half an hour to get it right. He tightened the wood down to the table with a clamp, started in with his D-shaped coping saw, and promptly broke the thin blade. He inserted the only spare he'd brought, feeling like a soldier down to his last bullet. He worked gingerly. The blade survived. The file that followed the same path not only smoothed the wood's edge, but snapped off a sizable chunk of the angel's wing. He slammed the file onto the table. He hated wood. He took a break, frightened by his anger in the face of this setback. There was no channel changer here. He picked up the whirligig book and stared at the previous owner's patient, precise script. He almost felt the man was with him, telling him to settle down and conquer the project calmly, step by step. So take a moment to make a personal connection of your own. Think about a time when you were tasked with doing something, and it could be a wood project, it could be a project outside, it could be an art class, it could be in math. And think about how you felt when something that you were doing didn't go the way it should the first time around. Brent sat down. He decided to do without the wing. The figure could simply be a harp player. The harp was full size, the sort you'd find in an orchestra. Leah had played in an orchestra. He wondered what her instrument was. He sawed off the rest of the wing, sanded the wood, then went to his pack and dug out his 5 tubes of acrylic paint. In the trash can, he found a styrofoam cup, which he filled with water for cleaning his brushes. From the same source, he retrieved a paper plate to use as a palette. He painted one side of the figure, let it dry a bit, then leaned it on a stone and painted the other, making her hair black rather than the yellow prescribed by the book. Down one side, he printed Leah's name with a black permanent marker, then used it and his tape measure to draw the harp strings. He considered his work. It wasn't perfect, especially the outline of the face. It looked nothing like her picture. He repainted the mouth, but only made matters worse. The 2 sides should have been identical, but weren't. It was the best he could do. He stopped and ate lunch. All afternoon was spent on Leah's propeller-shaped arms. He'd begun referring to the whirligig by her name and almost felt he was reassembling her broken body, reviving her. Each arm required much whittling and sanding. Suddenly, he was halted by the strangeness of his task. He saw it as his parents had. "Why am I doing this?" he said aloud. The whole enterprise seemed taken from a dream, incomprehensible in the light of day. Now, a thick question that we could ask, that is a reflective question, we have to think about it. Some pieces of what we've already read would support our answer. And it could have many answers is, why is Brent going around to the 4 corners of the United States and creating whirligigs? He returned to work. What he knew without question was that it felt good to be busy toiling in atonement. So right there, actually, kind of tells us he wants to make amends. Atonement is making amends. Toiling means that you're laboring, you're doing something physical. To direct his feelings outward through his arms and knife, as if draining an abscess. Now and then his eyes crossed Puget Sound to the Olympic range and settled on the peak the cyclist had told him was Mount Olympus. The home of the Greek gods, Brent mused. Hadn't Hercules likewise performed his labors to cleanse himself of a crime? From Miss Lifton's class in his previous life, the story returned to him while he worked, of the Greek hero slaying his wife and children in a fit of insanity, his asking an oracle how he could atone, or telling him to seek out a certain king and perform for him 12 labors. His tasks had just been as bizarre as Brent's, and likewise had called for long journeys. Brent worked until late. He cut his hand 3 different times and suspected that part of him wasn't content with the labors he'd been assigned and longed to mete out more punishment. He laid out the whirligig's various parts and set them shining with a thick coat of varnish. Leah's eyes glistened as if she'd awakened. Finally, he put down his tools, built a fire, and warmed another can of soup. He returned to work early the next morning, bent over his book like a biblical scholar, mumbling, rereading, receiving sudden insights. He carefully mounted the arms on the finger. The placement was tricky. He tried to figure out why one arm didn't spin and adjusted it endlessly. Next, he agonized over the figure's pivot point, marked the spot, drilled the hole, and hoped for the best. He pounded some tubing into the hole. Now, I have a question. Maybe it's a thin question, and maybe you guys can answer it for me. However, I'm just noticing that he has a saw, he has a drill, he has wood, he has paint, and other materials, all for making this whirligig. He has the whirligig book. So my thought is, okay, on a bus you can have a pretty big duffel bag. However, how is he walking around with this huge duffel bag? Maybe it's not as big as I'm imagining. I'm having a hard time trying to visualize the bag because I don't know a lot about tools. And the tools that I know are in our garage, and they're huge. Like, Brent couldn't be running around with the drill that Mr. C has. The figure turned smoothly from side to side. He glued the dowel into a chunk of 2x4 he found along the shore. He tingled. He realized he was finished. He blew upon it. The arms pinwheeled, seeming to strum the heartstrings. He could hardly believe it actually worked. He blew 50 more times for confirmation. He now wondered where to set it up. Was it legal to mount it on state land? Then again, the park belonged to the public. Better here than in someone's front yard. He'd have to hope the harpist so charmed the rangers that they wouldn't remove it. How to mount it was a further problem. He hadn't brought 10-foot poles in his pack. He paced the site, deliberating. Then he spied a tree limb, roughly horizontal, open to the wind from the west and high enough to keep his work out of reach. He climbed out and nailed the driftwood mount. Then he returned for the whirligig. Back on the ground, he stared up at it. The harp player was just over a foot tall and seemed much smaller from a distance. Brent awaited a breeze until his neck ached. When it came, the figure felt it first. It swung on the dowel like a weather vane. The arms lifted, then trembled, then spun. He felt the breeze. The arms gained speed. His smile widened. The phrase, the breath of life, traveled through his mind. He watched, mesmerized. Then he ran for the camera. I want you to pause a moment before we start the next chapter and think about the phrase, the breath of life. How has Brent given Leah a new breath of life? Okay, we're now on Miami, Florida, and we're on page 55. So the setting has changed. We just left Seattle, and now we are across and south of the United States. Still dark outside, no traffic, just me. This is how I like it. Muy tranquilo. I never saw a street sweeper in my life until I came from Puerto Rico. So I'm going to pause there. I don't think that the narrator of this chapter is Brent. I'm thinking that Brent is not from Puerto Rico. So we must be talking about some other character, I have no idea who, but it just doesn't make sense that it's Brent who's telling the story right now. The first week here, it woke me up. I was 11. I thought it was a monster. Then I looked out the window and saw it pass. I saw the man inside. I wondered what he thinks about driving all night in the dark, alone. And now I'm driving a street sweeper. Maybe the same one. And now I know what the driver thinks. Watching the curb, watching parked cars, looking down at the gutter broom, thinking when to use the sprayer, thinking about other times in my life, enjoying the peaceful night. So in this paragraph, we found out that whoever this character is from Puerto Rico. He is a street sweeper, and he used to think about being, or what street sweepers used to think about when they were driving when he was little. Peace is a very hard thing to find. The Pope is always asking for peace. He tells all the countries to stop their wars. Every year he tells them, but more wars always come. Always people disagree and fight. Do you think peace is a very hard thing to find? What about in your own life? Do you find peace difficult to get? I think about why this is while I drive. I think about the shearwater bird. It's March, still cool at night, like Puerto Rico in the mountains where I lived. The air was cool there. Life was more calm. For a while anyway. Then my father had to sell our farm to a power company. Lots of families had to. They covered our farm with water to make a lake, to make electricity. Many people there were angry. My family left the mountains where we'd always lived. We moved to San Juan on the coast. San Juan is a very big city. There were 5 children in my family. People laughed at how we talked. Boys fought me. Some people laughed at my father's straw hat. Many times I heard my father and mother argue. Other people argued against the government. Some wanted Puerto Rico to join the United States. Others wanted it to be its own country. Others wanted it to be something else. All were fighting against each other. One day a bomb went off near our house. I ran to see. Then I wish I didn't. I saw a man lying down in his own blood. 1 month later, we flew in a plane to Miami. So to reflect on all of us, we have our own difficulties in our lives. But this sounds really like a difficult childhood. With 5 kids in Puerto Rico, obviously people and the government were having some kind of civil wars, and then the bombing. It's hard for us, I think, to visualize the bombing because, thank goodness, we have never had to experience that. And you could say that you could visualize it based on movies that you've seen, but that's not real life. No one in my family spoke English. In the mountains, there was only Spanish. In school here, I listened to the teacher, but I didn't understand anything. I would look a long time at her ring and her necklace and her shoes and at the other students and out the window. That's all I did that first year. The next year I went to junior high. There was lots to look at in woodworking class. But my teacher got mad when I didn't look at him. He asked me a question one time. I didn't know what he said, so I didn't say anything back. His face got red. He ran up to my chair. Then he grabbed my chair and lifted me up and yelled some words right in my face. I hated that teacher. He didn't know Spanish. When he let me go, I swore at him in Spanish. Then I ran out of the room and went home. Next week, they made me take a test. Then they said I could move to a different school. I was glad. Then I went there. It was a school for retarded children. That's where they put kids who didn't know English. I told my father I wouldn't go. He said, "School in America makes your life better." We had lots of arguments. I pretended to go, but instead, I would walk around or go to the park to watch the tennis players. When I was 14, I got a job in the restaurant when I was supposed to be in school. I brought home the money and gave it to my father. I knew he needed it for the rent. He took it. I quit pretending to go to school after that. In the restaurant, I worked the dishwasher machine. Everyone spoke Spanish. I liked it there. The waitresses all called me Flaco because I was skinny. They used to bring me food. It was a good job. But people argued there too. There were 2 cooks, one from Puerto Rico. He only liked Puerto Rican salsa music. Willie Colon was his favorite. He brought in tapes of Willie Colon's band and would hit the spatula on the grill like a drum. The other cook was from Jamaica. He only liked reggae. On weekends, there was a 3rd cook from Cuba. They used to fight over the tape player. Not even the Pope could stop this war. I'm going to pause here, and I want you to reflect on what we have learned about this new character, Flacco, because we don't really know his name yet.